Croeso. Welcome to our talk on 100 years of disestablishment in Wales. My name is Cathy Riddick and I'm the coordinator for Wales Humanists, which is part of Humanists UK. And this evening we're talking about the launch of our report into the fact that it's been 100 years since Wales disestablished from the Church of England. You should have hopefully all received a copy of the report today. But we've invited you this evening to listen to our speakers who are going to talk to you in more detail about several sections of the report. There's an opportunity to ask questions. Please do so, and we'll put these to the panel at the end of their sections. But I'd like to introduce our speakers to you first. So Julie Morgan, who I'm sure you all have heard of, is member of the Senedd for Cardiff North. She's also extremely busy at the moment in her role as the Deputy Minister for Health and Social Services, and she's one of our patrons at Humanists UK. We also have Dr. Iolo Gwyn, patron, scientist, previously Professor of Zoology at Aberystwyth University, and our Chief Executive, Andrew Copson, who's been Chief Executive of Humanists UK since 2010, and he's also the President of Humanists International. So first of all, I'd like to hand you over to Julie Morgan, if you'd like to tell us your thoughts on disestablishment in Wales.
Diolch, Cathy, a diolch am y gwahoddiad. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here this evening to celebrate 100 years of disestablishment in Wales. One of the interesting things when I was looking at the disestablishment, I also realised it's also the disendowment of the church. And we all benefit in Wales from the wealth of the church. When I was a county councillor, we had the Church Act fund, which we used frequently, and of course money went to the universities and money went to charities. So it's interesting that we are practically benefiting as a people in Wales from the disestablishment even now. I know that Swansea University, for example, I think they bought beds for their students as a result of using the funds from the disestablishment. But I think that's actually something that not many people realise. So I was really interested in remembering that. Now, we were meant to be holding this celebration in the Senedd back in March, but unfortunately the coronavirus pandemic has meant that it had to be postponed. And now, you know, obviously, like everything else, has to be held online, but it's really great, I think, that we're actually having it. And I'm very pleased to be speaking to you here today as a member of the Senedd, which since its inception has prided itself on being a completely open and inclusive institution which represents every person in Wales, no matter their race, sex, gender, age, religion, or none. And the Welsh Church Act of 1914 paved the way for this to happen. I've always been a great believer in devolution and was part of the Yes campaign in 1999. And I've been involved in the Welsh Assembly, which is now proudly called the Senedd, either directly or indirectly ever since. So I was actually an MP in 1997. We actually voted for devolution, and that's one of the proudest things I've taken part in, is voting for devolution to happen. So in the early days of creating the new democracy in Wales, it was really felt that this was our chance to move away from the old traditions of Westminster and the chance to pave the way to creating a more inclusive approach to governing. So in plenary each week, we don't start proceedings with Anglican prayers, as is done in Westminster. And I remember very clearly when I was an MP in Westminster that prayers took place at the beginning of every session, and you stood with your backs to the chamber, you faced the wall to say the prayers. There's a reason for it, but I can't remember what the reason is. And you actually did get an advantage because the speaker would move on to questions immediately. And so if you weren't there from the beginning, or a debate, if you weren't there right from the beginning, you didn't get called. So in fact, those people who wanted to take part in the prayers in Westminster did have an advantage. So it was quite a relief to come to the Senedd, where there are no prayers, and there is a great advantage, really, because there's no advantage or disadvantage to Senedd members on the basis of religion or belief. And we firmly believe that everyone should be treated as equals and with dignity, no matter the member's religion or belief. So this approach has meant that the Welsh Government and Senedd have been able to lead the way in a number of ways. The new curriculum for Wales is firmly rights-based, and I know that the humanists have been involved in discussion about that, offering children education which is fully inclusive on education and beliefs, as well as relationships and sexuality. The Curriculum and Assessment Wales Bill states that schools must teach humanism alongside other world religions. I believe it is important for children to understand the world from the perspective of different faiths, non-faiths, and philosophical ideas within the context of the multicultural, multi-faith society Wales is today. In fact, this week, I've had quite a rush of emails from constituents asking me to object to this new way of teaching. But I firmly believe that this is the right thing to do for our future generations. Wales has also led the way in changing our organ donation system, moving towards an opt-out system. And this year, we also saw the passing of the Children, Abolition of the Defence of Reasonable Punishment Wales Act 2020. I was the minister who brought this in, and that was something I was very proud of, because I've actually campaigned to protect children's rights in this way for over 20 years. I started off when I was in Westminster, campaigning for the Westminster government to change the law for England and Wales. But then when I became a Senedd member, I was able to campaign there. But it has taken a huge effort to get this act into being. And I know that the humanists have been very supportive during that, because how can it ever be right to give an excuse for hitting a child? So I think that has been a huge step forward with the Welsh Government, and I hope that it will happen certainly in England in time to come. And so this was a great step forward for Wales. So both in bringing the changes to organ donation and the removal of the defence of reasonable punishment, the Welsh Government did extensively consult all faith and belief groups to listen to their views on the proposals and take on board any concerns and suggestions. And I know that the humanists are now being involved more and more in discussion and debate about Welsh policy initiatives, because it's important that everyone is represented in these decisions that will affect all our lives. So Wales is, I think, leading the way in our secular approaches to governing, because Wales now, since its establishment, Wales has no official church. It is a secular country. And I think that does bring a different spirit, because no church has an advantage, and every religion is equal, and no people with no faith should be equal as well. And that's what I think we are moving towards. I know that in the report the Wales Humanists are launching today, faith schools are able to discriminate, we know, in their admissions, employment and curriculum. And I was recently contacted by a constituent whose child was unable to go up to high school with the rest of their friends as they weren't baptised. And despite my interventions and the child actually living next to the school, we were unable to secure a place for them purely based on their faith or belief. And that cannot be right. And the coronavirus pandemic has further highlighted the fact that humanist weddings are not legally recognised. The lockdowns in Wales saw religious couples being able to go ahead with their wedding ceremonies, whereas couples wanting a humanist wedding were denied this. Unfortunately, marriage law is not devolved to Wales, so we are reliant on the UK government for this equality to happen. I'd very much like to see this devolved to Wales so that we can end this discrimination. And so, you know, even though the Senedd is an open and inclusive institution, there are some things that certainly do need improving. Last year, I wrote to the Llywydd to ensure that there was non-religious pastoral care available to members and all staff if they should need it. This was in response to being made aware that there was a chaplaincy support available every week. And as you know, Rodri, my husband, was also a humanist patron. And when he died, we as a family felt it was very important that we had a funeral that reflected his views, because too often you see church ceremonies taking place for people who had no religious belief. So therefore, the Senedd held the first state funeral based on the person's own beliefs. And we were very proud to have former AM Lorraine Barrett to lead the funeral. So I'm proud of the way Wales has made sure that it's become a place where people of all faiths and none are able to contribute to Welsh society. We've come a very long way since 1920, when the Welsh Church Act came into force. And I hope that those that brought in the Act are proud of the Wales that we are living in today. But I do reiterate, we still have a way to go in a number of areas. But thanks so much for all that you in the humanists, and I am part of that as well. Thanks for all that you're doing to take things forward. So diolch yn fawr iawn, and I'll now hand over to Iolo ap Gwyn.
Diolch Julie, croeso a diolch am yr gwahoddiad i wneud cyfraniad heno. Cyfraniad fydd yn bach yn wahanol falle, gan fod yng nghefndir i o fyd bioleg. A wedyn mynd i droi ar Saesneg wedyn i egluro hynny. Just saying that to thank for the invitation to say a few words, but also to think in terms of how a biologist looks at things. And I think that this ties in with a lot of what humanists thought. In other words, you try to rationalize on the basis of real knowledge, whatever situation you find yourself in. And we think of the education system, of course. Education system, I can well remember my own experience in primary school. I went for a couple of years to a church primary school, although it was a disestablished one. It was an Anglican church school. And that's coming from a family that used to go to a Methodist Sunday school. And I really got my brain scrambled up in terms of the religious rituals involved and so on, which was quite interesting itself. But it did emphasize really that this campaign by the humanists to try and get the education system to teach children about the whole variety of different memes, if you like, if you want to put it in Richard Dawkins's terms, the religious memes, but try to get into kids' heads. And if you look at Welsh history, and this is where I go to trying to analyze and understand where we are, is that one of the reasons why so many of us still speak our language here in Wales today is because the Bible was translated into Welsh by William Morgan many, many centuries ago. And the problem was, of course, that the reason why they did it was to try and get the Welsh people to behave themselves in terms of doing what the church told them to do. And of course, there was the inevitable tie between the church and the state and so on. And it was a political thing to do it. But there's not a bad thing, there's not a good side to it. And the good side of it, it means that through the Welsh schools of Griffith Jones, Llanddowror and so on, Wales became one of the most literate nations, probably most anywhere, going back into the 18th century. And there were over 3,500 schools set up. But again, the idea was to teach religion, to make sure people behaved. Unfortunately for the establishment, if you might, who were behind this, of course, the Welsh people are very varied. Our geography, behind me there's a picture of Cwmidwal, one of the beautiful valleys in Snowdonia. And this is where, of course, Charles Darwin came to realize that the rocks were very old, and he began to understand a bit about geology. That's what stimulated him, was visiting Cwmidwal. Now, if you look at Welsh society, it reminds me of my dear old friend, Professor Phil Williams, who was actually a member of the Assembly then. He died far too early, and I often used to have chats with Phil. And one of the things that I remember stays in my mind, Phil used to say, you know what he said, and he was from Caerphilly. He said, the English were conquered in one day, Battle of Hastings and all that. In other words, they had one leader and everybody followed the leader. So you kill the leader, you take over, and then people just sort of kowtow to the new system. But that never happened in Wales. Because basically Wales is a community of communities and very different communities, and they retained that difference. It was seen in terms of religion, for instance, that you had areas where Quakers were very strong, particularly in Meirionydd, and that a lot of them fled to Pennsylvania, and it's quite possible that Pennsylvania could have been called the New Wales at one time. And so it was religious persecution. Then you had down in Cardigan here, you got things like the Unitarian Church in some areas, very strong and to the exclusion of everybody else. And then even in other areas, you had Methodists and other different sort of angles on nonconformism all over the place. And all tending to work very democratically in their own way, developing their own way of thinking. So it wasn't one system they were trying to change. It was a whole multifarious mixture of communities, each with its own different type of memes and so on. And that's, I think it's a fascinating history to look at. I think it's a great shame that Welsh history isn't really taught in Wales, or hasn't been anyway, and there are nice good signs now that with the new curriculum they may well be taught about many of these things, including of course the rise of the Chartists and the Rebecca riots and all the rest of it. And these were all reflected community action, people reacting to what was very harsh conditions, but harsh conditions lead very often to people cooperating, helping each other. And this is one of the reasons why I think we have this feeling in Wales, and why, of course, Nye Bevan was involved with setting up the NHS. He came from a community where people in that community had a great regard for each other and helped each other. And I think this is a feature of Welsh communities. It isn't one Welsh community, it's very many communities. And it's the diversity of those communities that's the beauty of Wales. We are united in many ways by our language. We differ a little bit in the way we pronounce it, but not as much as many other languages. After all, have you tried to understand the English of a Liverpudlian, for instance? Or when you get to Glasgow, it's a very much a different thing. So it's this variety, I think, that is so important. And why kids should be educated in this variety and in the variety of religious ideas that come from people who've come to stay with and live with us and share our company in our land and bring their ideas with them. And in fact, most religions have some good ideas in them, and it's good to talk about them. But when it gets down to deciding what is actually true or not, that is a very different matter. Now, that's why, of course, it's very important that the bodies like the Standing Advisory Councils on Religious Education, why they have humanists on board, because you get this view, this balance, this analytical view of a situation we find ourselves in. You get that if you get humanists around. And I think this is very, very important, because there's no such thing as somebody who isn't unbiased. And I think this is why we need to have and be inclusive and have all these things together, which has led us really to, as a biologist, looking at the way legislation on the gifting of organs for transplantation has been managed in Wales. And I think this reflects, again, the type of society that we're in. And Julie mentioned the business of slapping children and all that. I think it does reflect on Welsh society, and it's something we should be immensely proud of as Welsh people, that we do have something very valuable. We're genetically no different from anybody else on this planet, but we have a gift of a language which is very variable, which is very beautiful language. We also have the other languages, of course. I mean, almost everybody who speaks Welsh speaks English, but that's not a reason for not speaking Welsh, because Welsh does give perspectives, different perspectives. It has its own memes. It certainly has its own memes that are not translatable even into other languages. And it does give you that added ability to try and understand other cultures. I spent some time living in Switzerland for a period, and if you want to find a mix of different cultures and different ways of viewing things, well, Switzerland is certainly the place to do it. And that emphasized to me how important variety is in order to create a tolerant society, which I'm sure that if you're looking at what I think humanists are looking for, is a tolerant society, that we listen to other people, but also we keep our minds open to what science tells us, what our new knowledge tells us. And as I've tried to just imply to a few examples, is what history tells us. And of course, history is what people teach you, and it can be very selective. Mind you, science can be selective as well. So in that context, I would like to pass on to Andrew, who's going to sort of bring us back on course, maybe.
Diolch, yeah, Iolo. Thank you very much. Yes, so we've heard about the effects of the disestablishment of the church when it came to setting up the devolved administrations, and how important that was for paving the way to a more inclusive, probably the most inclusive approach within the UK of any administration at all. And we've heard some more about the nature of Welsh society from Iolo. It's true that Wales, in terms of secularization of the population, has led the way within these islands. There's a higher proportion of people with non-religious beliefs, non-religious identities in Wales than elsewhere. And of course, devolution, as Julie said, offers the perfect opportunity to tailor policies and solutions to populations at the level where it makes most sense. And that's certainly what we've seen in Wales. I'm going to speak a little bit about the unfinished business of that process. There are 5 areas where I want to talk about this. So the first is in relation to collective worship. England and Wales, and those countries are still yoked together in this respect. England and Wales are the only countries in the world to impose by law daily Christian worship in state schools as standard, in spite of the range of different religions and beliefs of pupils today, and in spite of the fact that clear over 70% of those of parental age themselves are not religious, as are most young people. Now, unfortunately, the curriculum and assessment bill that is still clearing the Senate at the moment was an opportunity to fix this outmoded law, but that opportunity hasn't been taken. So this collective worship law, which was inherited from the Westminster administration and was extremely controversial in 1944 when it was introduced with Welsh MPs and with Welsh people, has continued in Wales. So that's the first thing, that requirement for daily Christian worship in all state schools, which is so unusual in the world and egregious, does need to be addressed to ensure freedom of religion and belief in Wales. Then secondly, of course, there are faith schools themselves. I remember Rhodri Morgan's own view on this when we used to discuss it with him, was that faith schools, though they shouldn't be expanded, if they continued to exist, I think he thought, would naturally become more inclusive over time. And in Wales, compared with other parts of the UK, this has been the case. They have been, we haven't seen in Wales the same sort of growth and expansion and re-religionisation of faith schools that we have seen in England. We haven't seen that in Wales to the same extent. And it's true that in the present education bill, Wales has delivered a very progressive answer to removing the parental right to withdraw from RE by making it a requirement for even faith schools to teach non-denominational RE where requested, and that's good. But nonetheless, there are still natural problems that emerge from having any involvement in provision of education, state education, fully at state expense by churches. And Julie has mentioned some of those from the point of view of her own constituents. Evidence shows, and the geography of Wales shows, that many families have little or no choice whether they go to a faith school or not, and also fewer choices when their local school is a faith school as to whether or not they're likely to get in. So that's my second thing: collective worship first, faith schools second. This is the unfinished business agenda for the Act. The third is the question of pastoral care and chaplaincy in hospitals. The NHS in England 5 years ago amended all of their guidance on chaplaincy and pastoral care to make it clear that equality law and good practice and the needs of patients and staff now should mandate that there was equal pastoral care provided by like-minded people to the non-religious in the settings where religious people had the benefit of chaplaincy. And although we've seen an expansion of paid non-religious pastoral care posts in the NHS in England, that hasn't happened in the NHS in Wales. There are still no employees, no paid pastoral care chaplain equivalent positions within the NHS for the non-religious. And the £1.2 million spent on chaplaincy in the last financial year in the NHS in Wales was in large part, huge part really, funding Church in Wales chaplains, which is, to say it's not representative of the population of Wales is an understatement. If you look at the actual religion and belief demography of Wales today, it's a small minority of people receiving the vast majority of state funds. And there's a real need for non-religious pastoral care, which isn't being realised. That's the third thing. The fourth thing I won't dwell on, because Julie's mentioned it too, marriage law needs to be devolved to Wales. Look at Scotland, where humanist marriage became lawful 15 years ago and has now become the most popular type of marriage, responding to that pent-up demand. Look at Northern Ireland, where it's become lawful through a High Court judgment just a couple of years ago, and is now fastest growing type of marriage in Northern Ireland. Look at the Channel Islands within these islands. Wherever there has been devolved responsibility or separate responsibility for marriage law, jurisdictions have been able to respond to and show themselves willing to respond to the natural preferences of couples to have a marriage that best reflects their beliefs and values, conducted by someone who shares them in the way that they want their ceremony that starts their married life to be. That's needed for Wales. There's no reason why the fact that the Westminster government doesn't like humanist marriage should mean that humanists in Wales can't get married, not in these days of devolution. So the Senedd needs to take power for marriage law. That needs to be devolved, as was mentioned. And then, of course, there's the general question of national life. As we've heard, the Senedd was founded on secular principles. It couldn't really have been done any other way, given the almost century by then and now full century of disestablishment that existed and the nature of Welsh society. And there have been advances in education to be a more pluralistic and objective affair. And I think everyone's optimistic of continued change. But there are still areas in what you might call national life in Wales where the church in Wales and religion generally is given an undue influence. It can't be right that services like services of remembrance, that after all mark the contributions and sacrifices of people of all different beliefs, including the growing numbers of non-religious people serving in our armed forces and in civilian life today, are still conducted solely by the church in Wales, when they should be secular and inclusive in the same way that the national institutions of Wales are. or that there's a forum where representatives of religious communities have regular access to politicians and to the First Minister, which still doesn't engage with humanists or permit the membership of humanist organisations on a religion or belief basis, as they have only just in recent weeks in Northern Ireland. The good news about most of these things, most of these matters apart from marriage law, is that it is in the power of the government in Wales to take action and to respond to the needs and nature of Welsh society. And I suppose what we can reflect on in today's anniversary is what a long journey that has been to bring us to that point, but how consistently over time change has been progressive. Wales leads the way now within the UK in terms of being a secular jurisdiction, a secular state, in terms of the advances made in curriculum reform and the advances made in the secularity and inclusive nature of public life. And it doesn't have far to go until the job is completely done. And I hope we'll see that before another 100 years.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Andrew, Iolo and Julie for those really interesting comments on the state of our nation in Wales. There's a really good comment come in on the question board that I'd just like to read out. Somebody who's been following the US elections, watching the debates, where they were astonished by how significant the Christian beliefs of the candidates were on their political views, a lot of which were very negative, and it brought home how much more sensible our attitudes are here in Wales. So that's good to hear that it's quite obvious that we have these sensible attitudes to the way politics is being run in Wales. But there's a question that's come in for Julie on pastoral care. Somebody called David has said he's not aware of any non-religious pastoral care employees in the Welsh Health Trust chaplaincies. And with volunteer services currently withdrawn due to the pandemic, is that causing a disadvantage?
I think that is correct, that there are no employees in the Welsh Health Trusts or Welsh Health Boards. And certainly that is something that we have been pressing on for a number of years. I think it's very important that we do address this issue, because whenever I've raised this, the response I've often had is, but the religious pastoral care, the people doing that are willing to speak to anybody and offer comfort to anybody. But really, if you don't have the belief of the person who's offering you comfort, I do think that that is a big barrier. So I think it is quite hard for people who set this up to understand. And I think we've got quite a battle there to make people realise that if you want to have someone to comfort and to be with you, if you are in hospital or really in any sort of situation, you do want somebody who, shares your views. So I think that this is quite an issue, really, and this is something that we really have to continue to campaign about.
Thanks for that, Julie. A question now from Andrew. Perhaps I put this to Andrew Copson. Shouldn't everyone in Wales be campaigning to get the 26 English bishops out of the House of Lords as a first step to abolishing that institution? Andrew?
Well, yes, is the short answer, I think. But it is a strange continuing discrepancy, isn't it? That although in Wales the church was established in 1920, in Northern Ireland it was established in 1870. When it was Ireland. In Scotland, of course, the Anglican Church was never established, and the Church of Scotland has a sort of national church role, but not as an established church. But even though England is the only nation of the UK in which the church is established, it's in the UK Parliament that they wield their power, which is a parliament that covers the whole of the UK. So yes, I think that the effect that Church of England bishops from England have in our parliament, and it's not just voting on laws, although there have been times when they've been decisive in their votes on laws over the last few years. They've made a difference with their votes in the House of Lords. It's not just having votes on our laws. It's also having, briefings, having the status within Parliament of a parliamentary party, having funding for their political activities on the same basis as other members of the House of Lords and other parliamentarians are funded out of state money to run their contributions. All of those, literal access to the corridors, to the literal corridors of power as they walk around the Palace of Westminster, as Julie will be familiar with, it's completely wrong. So I think there is that dimension still, to that problem that isn't commonly recognised. The devolution question as it relates to religion in the Westminster Parliament is a pretty severe one. And you wouldn't, occasionally people say, oh, well, we should add Church in Wales clerics to the House of Lords to deal with it. But of course, that's entirely the wrong solution. So it should go the other way.
Yes.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Now, a question for Julie, because I know it's something that you have been quite heavily involved in previously. Shouldn't the devolved government be taking a lead on assisted dying legislation?
Well, we don't have the powers to change that legislation, but nevertheless, we do have the powers to represent the views of people in the Senedd, and also we have the powers to try to influence. So we did have a debate when the last time there was a private member's bill going through the House of Lords. And so we did have a debate in the Senedd then, which I was very proactive in because I do believe that this is something that should be in place. I think it's complicated and difficult, and I think lots of aspects have to be considered. So I would never say it was easy, and there are lots of areas that have to be looked at very carefully, and you need to protect any abuse of any assisted dying that was agreed. But I do really feel that this is something that we should progress towards. So we did have a debate, a very strong, a very highly charged debate, but the motion that I was supporting was overwhelmingly defeated, actually. We didn't have many support people actually voting for it in the chamber, and it hasn't come back since, but I believe it will come back. And I think that other countries are addressing it now. Things are progressing. And I think that it will come back. But yes, I think it's definitely something that we should be pushing. Although, again, as I say, we don't have the powers to change the law. That is with Westminster. But we obviously represent all of Wales, or everybody in Wales. And we do need to represent people's views on this.
Thank you, Julie. A question now for Iolo. What do you think the rest of the UK can learn from Wales?
I think the rest of the UK can learn from Wales that the worst thing you can do is to ignore your own history. And if you really want to understand how your communities came to be and how they formed and how people's collective thoughts and ideas and so on form, then you need to understand your own history, your own biology, your own everything. Where did you come from? How did it form? How did your culture form? How did your actual biological form, as it were? And I think this is what's so important, that in Wales we do have a chance because we're about the right size. I don't know if you've heard of the economist stroke philosopher Leopold Kohr. He wrote many books back in the 1960s, 1970s, all about governing and the optimal size of communities for governing themselves and so on. Fascinating ideas, and he developed these on the basis of studying different communities across Europe. He was an Austrian. And he said that the important thing was to have a community where you were able to communicate with most people in that community in some way or another. And there was, you reckon you could communicate with about 20 people a day on average, if you're lucky. And that in that kind of dimension, the further you go away from that dimension, the more difficult it is to do things and to do things collectively. And the wrong idea is to try and be have a country is trying to impose one will on everybody. And I hope in Wales that we have learned that lesson, that our strength is in our diversity and in the way that diversity cooperates in order for the good of the individual and for the good of the communities. It takes me back to Margaret Thatcher. I mean, for that person to say there was no such thing as community was, you know, sacrilegious, if it's right to use that word. But I think that this is the basis. We have a country in Wales based on communities in the valleys, communities in rural areas and so on. And those communities are very strong. Look at the way they do that. And I mentioned Switzerland earlier. You do get that there as well.
Thank you, Iolo. A question from Roger. Why is my county council of Flintshire still starting meetings with prayers? Roger, if I can answer that for you, they shouldn't be. No local authority meetings should contain a requirement for prayers. They are allowed to hold prayers outside of their meetings within the council premises. There is nothing wrong with that if that's what certain councillors choose to do, but it shouldn't be part of the local authority meetings. If it is, please drop me an email and we'll take that up with the local authority with you, and we're quite happy to do that. The next question for Julie, if I can, is from Mike, who wants to know if devolution of further powers to Wales is totally down to Westminster, or can the Welsh Government be proactive in gaining control over matters such as marriage and assisted dying?
Because of the situation, because the UK now is made up of 4 nations, it's really important, I think, that we have some way of of removing the dominance of England in a way over the other 3 nations, that we need to be more equal partners. I believe very strongly that the UK should be more of a federal setup, and that each country should do locally what it can do and is best placed to do, and only things are done for all the 4 countries if they are best done in that sort of way. And I think in order to do this, we do need a constitutional convention. I do think that we need to work it all out, and certainly Wales can lobby for more powers. And I know that in the Senedd, we are very keen to have more powers. And so we will be lobbying for more powers. And well, this call for this constitutional convention has been going on for some time because of the awkward nature of devolution. But we don't want to be in the position where powers are given to us by Westminster, sort of deferred upon us, and we're not supposed to have that sort of arrangement. So we do need a constitutional convention where the Welsh representatives, the representatives of the Welsh Government can lobby for the powers it thinks it should have. And I think we certainly do need more powers. And in the present situation, we're actually losing powers with what's happening with the European Union with Brexit. We are losing powers in Wales, and we're losing control of money in Wales. The structural funds are no longer going to be part of it. The Welsh government may not be involved in arranging how they are given out. And there's lots of ways really that devolution is creeping back at the moment, because we have a government in Westminster that is not sympathetic to devolution. So we have to be very much on our guard to try to stop any more erosion of our powers, and to try to lobby for a constitutional convention where we can argue for more equality between the nations.
Thank you, Julie. Question for Andrew. Would the introduction of a written constitution lead to a secular state and achievement of many humanist aims?
Well, I think this is a very interesting question. I mean, there is no doubt at all that around the world, where constitutions have been written in the face of the sort of demography that Wales has at the moment, i.e. diversity and also a great overwhelming majority of non-religious people, there is no doubt that constitutions around the world that have been written in that situation, like, for example, most recently, Sweden, Iraq, Nepal, Fiji, there is no doubt at all that those constitutions have tended to be secular. And I can't imagine a constitution written either in Wales or, is this a question about the UK possibly, and not just about Wales? It doesn't say actually, but I think it's probably less true of the UK as a whole, but certainly in Wales, if a constitution was written in Wales, just as if it was written in Scotland, just as if it was written probably in Northern Ireland, there's no doubt in my mind at all that it would be secular. I mean, the emergent state in Wales and the emergent state in Scotland, for example, are just secular states. You know, they're organized along secular lines, inclusive lines, national lines, plural lines, rather than anything else. So a written constitution, I think, would just definitely lead to a secular state. If this is a question about the UK more widely, of course, I think it's a bit more difficult, because the fact is that in spite of its diminishing number, almost down to nothing, of adherents, the Church of England, in both England and the UK, retains enormous power. You know, it retains enormous wealth, enormous influence, enormous privilege, and it sort of is kept going, you know, by those things. You know, it's the 8th richest NGO in the world, and what is it, the 2nd or 3rd biggest landowner in England. So it retains incredible influence. So I think if there were a written constitution for the UK, even on a constitutional convention, you might find that because of the power of religious lobbyists and particularly the Church of England, England at least got landed with some sort of non-secular constitution for a few decades to come. But I think if it were in Wales, I mean, in Wales or in Scotland, it would just obviously be a secular constitution, because they'd be modern states, and that's been the tendency around the world outside the Islamic world, is that new states, modern states, have had secular constitutions.
Thank you, Andrew. A question for Julie. What are the chances of the Senedd introducing legislation to get rid of the mainly Christian collective worship assemblies?
Well, it has been raised, and it has been discussed at length. And as I think you said at maybe Andrew said it, we haven't made any progress. And this is certainly something that has caused a lot of concern for a very long time. And it was certainly a matter when I was an MP in Westminster, it was an issue that was being constantly raised. And I believe it will change. I think that probably it's only a matter of time, but it does mean constant lobbying and debate and discussion to try to move it on. Because I think it is very outdated for this to continue, and I think that most people in Wales would be in support. So it's not imminent. I know, because I know we haven't succeeded yet in persuading people that maybe not that it's not the right thing to do, but that this isn't the time to do it. So I think that's really one of the issues.
Thank you, Julie. A question from Anthony. Our humanist group in West Wales has been trying to get involved in the local SACRE, but to no avail. Standing advisory councils on religious education currently can choose to permit who they feel reflect the beliefs of the local area. He says, what exactly are the laws in Wales around the selection and approval of SACRE members? It's up to the local authority at the moment who gets appointed to a SACRE. It should be reflective of the local faiths and beliefs. But they were written to back in 2018 by the Education Minister to say that humanists belonged on SACREs with full voting rights. And it's something that is going to be made into law with the new curriculum and assessment bill. So now is exactly the right time to apply again to your local authority and see if they will admit you to the SACRE, so that we can have that non-religious voice helping to guide religious education in all of our local authorities across Wales. Okay, a question from Gary. Although the established church is diminishing in Wales, 70% are identifying as non-religious, is there a rise of other beliefs such as evangelical churches? Iolo, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? That in the situation where you find one belief sort of waning a bit, it leaves the field open for other people to come in and try and collect followers, and I can see that happening. But this is where you need. I go back to strong communities again. You need people in those communities that are informed and that know how the religion fits into that community. I've got, you'd be surprised here, because I mean, lots of areas in Wales, the non-conformist chapels were very strong in those communities, and the only reason they even have members very often these days is that because of the strong community spirit. And because I've been willing to stick my neck out in Welsh society and actually say what I mean, what I believe and what I think, that I've had people who you would have thought are religious people. These are from the non-conformist chapels. They come and sort of talk to me privately, and they said, I agree with you, really, you know, it's just that I keep things going. And I'm not sure whether that's a sensible approach, because that's feeding the potential for what I would call extremist religious views, such as evangelicals and so on, to be able to take root, because you sow the seed of the ideas, the memes that they spread. And in the absence of rational thought and rational analysis of what's going on, then it's quite easy for people to come involved, because after all, it's a hell of a lot easier to believe something completely nonsensical than trying to work it out by logic and knowledge, because life is much more complicated than that. And life in all its aspects is much more complicated than what a simple answer coming from religion can give you.
Thank you, Iolo. Oh, sorry, Andrew.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, there is possibly a role for government there, you know, because it is definitely the case that there are buildings, for example, that function as community centres, especially in places where they might be the only hub that a community might have. You know, for example, it's a chapel or a church hall or something, but in fact it's more than that. You know, it's a place for people. The government in England and its governments in England and Scotland have signally failed to do anything to try and retain such buildings for the community when they lose their original religious purpose. And it may be that I don't think the government in Wales has done anything about this either, but it may be that in the future there is a role for governments when religions have declined almost down to nothing, including, as Iolo says, even the people who are tending the fire don't believe in it, you know, that it might be an enormous relief and an enormous benefit if actually there were some sort of scheme where either communities themselves or the government from Cardiff could provide funding or a vehicle for buildings to retain community use in those situations, because in England they're just sold off as bars and housing and so on, or restaurants, and in Scotland they've almost, it's been even faster paced than that. So it might be a possibility to do that. I don't know if there is such a scheme. They'd have to, I think, lose their religious use. They could be made available maybe to people of all different religions if they wanted to book them out, for their events or whatever. But I think that there's a use there for it, because there's a reduction generally in community centres and funded centres of various types across the UK, and this might be a way of getting sort of an influx of capital, at least properties, into common ownership. I don't know. I'm not going to put Julie on the spot by asking her what she thinks about this, because it's more of a random thought, but it's a possible way forward when buildings have got a long history in community use, and just the priorities of the community have changed and the beliefs of the community have changed. I don't think they should lose their asset necessarily, their hub.
Thank you, Andrew. I think we've got time for one final question that I'd like to start with Andrew on, and it's from Emma. Are you concerned that the causes of humanism could be set backwards by the increasing support that the far right seem to be accruing? And do we need to perhaps be a bit more forthright in fighting for what we believe in?
Yeah, I do think this. I mean, I think this in our country and countries and around the world. I think that the enemies of humanist values and the enemies of political secularism, aren't just religious groups and religious extremists. Religious extremists are one enormous threat in today's world to humanist values, but equal threats are, ethnic nationalists, white nationalists, all sorts of extremists who don't believe in equal human dignity, who don't believe in rational public debate, who don't believe in fairness and freedom in our laws and in our polity. And I agree that currently one severe manifestation of that is what we're calling in Europe the far right, or in the Western world the far right, which is obviously a concoction often of religious extremism plus ethnic nationalism plus racism plus sort of far right politics. So I am concerned by that, and I do think it's right for humanists to coalesce more around their values and fight for the positive sort of political and social values of solidarity, of freedom and fairness and equal treatment that we share. Yeah, I do.
I think, following on what Andrew just said, that I see this very much as it's a breakdown of society. It's communities are losing their cohesion as communities, and people they need that community feeling, and they get it from some of these organizations. I think it's quite a natural human thing, because I mean we evolved to live as tribes, and what kept those tribes together were often, it depended on what particular local circumstances you had to threaten them, or whatever they had to cooperate to actually achieve survival. And I think it's that community feeling, once that breaks down, then people are looking for it elsewhere. And if you have unscrupulous newspaper magnates, if you like, or media people who will encourage the spread of blatant nonsense, then people will often latch onto things. I mean, we've seen it in terms of, anti-vaxxers, for instance, in terms of the current debate about vaccination. Completely absurd arguments, but yet people grab at them basically because they must have a vacuum there that they are trying to fill in a different way. And I think if we look at this analytically, I think we need to be much more careful in the way we monitor media. And I think then the modern digital media, we've seen the dangers of how those getting out of control, in other words, people having crazy ideas, if they know how to do it, can get these ideas spread around very quickly, and as we've seen and as we've now paying the consequence for in the next few weeks.
Yes, I think there are certainly elements, of the far right in Wales, and as Iolo said, they are showing their faces really through the anti-vaxxers at the moment, and I'm sort of involved in a bit of political campaigning and telephone peopling, and you do come across this element. So I think it's crucial that we speak out for the values that we stand up for, and we need to do it in a way that does respect everybody's dignity, and we do respect other people's beliefs. But it's so important to get the voice of tolerance and the secular beliefs that we have. I think it's absolutely crucial that we speak out, loudly on this. So I think that question is very, very important, that we should be proudly campaigning, as I know we do, but even more loudly.
Thank you. Thank you to Julie, to Iolo and to Andrew for all of their time in their very busy schedules. And thank you to you all for listening for the last very quick hour. It's such a fascinating subject. I think we've come so far in Wales. We've got such a proud history of disestablishment, and we can only continue to progress further. If there's anything more you'd like to know about the report or the work that we do, please get in touch with us. And we look forward to holding more sessions like this until we can meet again in person. Thank you.